Greetings one and all. Super Thursdays here in the Holy Apple, Holy Land. Welcome. We're on the 23rd day of the month of Cheshvan, 1 week, the last week of the month of Cheshvan, the 8th month of the year, 5783. Yeah, today the title of the class is Judaism Woke, W-O-K-E. Hope you all know, politically correct, woke, progressive, liberal. Is Judaism woke? With God's help, we will have 2 classes on the subject. The subtitle of this class is, why was it that King David did not build the first temple for the Jewish people? Okay, that's the subtitle here. Let's begin. We have 2 sources in our Torah why King David did not build the temple. Source number 1 comes from Samuel 2, the 7th chapter, the 5th verse. There it says that King David is told by God that you will not build the temple for me. In fact, your son, when you pass away, your son will build the temple for me. It seems like here in Shmuel Bet, Samuel 2, it seems pretty clear that the reason why King David is not building the temple is because of the fact that he concentrated more on his home than being concerned with the temple. So by putting King David's self first, he lost the merit to build the temple. So there is no mention here of anything else besides for this idea of the fact that King David first put most of his work on the finishing of his home, his palace. Okay. Now our second source is in Chronicles, first volume, chapter 22, verse 8. It says there that King David says to his son Solomon that, Solomon, you will build the first temple. And God came to me and said, this is David talking, you will not be able to build the temple because of the fact that you spilled much blood and you did you fought many wars, and therefore you will not be able to build my house because of the fact that you've spilled a lot of blood. This is mentioned twice. Okay, the term you've spilled blood, much blood in wars is mentioned twice. And then you will have a son, and he will come and he will build the temple. Now this was hijacked by many pacifists and Jews, that the whole Torah is just love. This was really hijacked. And they say, you see, King David was not able to build the temple because he did terrible things. He had all these war crimes, he fought, and therefore God said, you've spilled blood and you could not build the temple. And so this is a familiar line that we hear over and over again by the leftists. So our journey, God willing, for this week and next week also will be seeing, is this correct? Is Judaism woke? This seems to be like a woke kind of attitude. Oh, King David, you fought all these wars for the Jewish people, you spilled a lot of blood, you could not build the temple for God. All these wars, all these crimes that you committed, all this bloodshed, you are not fit to build the temple. Only a man of peace. Okay, so let us see this. Our first question is, was King David a wealthy person or a poor person? Good question. Why? Because in the same Chronicles, volume 1, chapter 22, verse 14 this time, King David says an amazing statement, a contradiction of terms. On one hand, he says, I am poor. I have prepared for the house of Hashem, from the house of God, and he gives an astronomical amount of gold and silver and copper that he's prepared. It's like an astronomical amount. How could he say, I'm poor? And on the other hand, he has all of these assets, lucid assets at his fingertips. So it seems to be like a contradiction in terms. And we will see soon that our sages asked the same question. Was he poor or was he rich? Where did he have all this money? And then he calls himself a poor person. Was he poor or was he rich? Okay, so that is also a question. Question number 2. Where did King David get all of this money to put away for the building of the temple? So here we have the words of our sages in Yalkut Shimoni, in the book of Ruth, chapter 603. It tells an amazing story there, that King David, when he finished battle going against Goliath the giant, and he was victorious, the women, the daughters of the Jewish people, the mothers of the Jewish people showered. They thought that Goliath and the Philistines were going to slay them, going to murder them, pogrom them. And here comes this little King David and is victorious against the giant Goliath. They were sure that it was curtains for them. So they shower upon him silver and gold and copper, all types of jewelry and precious stones. They shower upon him. So King David, he takes all of this, not for himself. He takes all of this and puts it, he calls up the Brinks company and he gets a safe and he puts it all into the safe in order to save it for the day that will come when they will build the temple in Jerusalem on the holy mountain of Moriah. So that is how King David became a tremendously wealthy person. Okay, we said he's wealthy, but he says himself in the Chronicles, he says, I'm a poor man. So make up your mind, King David, are you poor? So this is the idea. Why does he consider himself poor? Because the Jewish people came to David. There was a famine in the land of Israel for a period of 3 years. That's a long time. There was a recession. There was a famine for 3 years. And the Jewish people, every so often, periodically came to King David and said, listen, we need help. We need assistance. We need them, how do they say? We need them welfare checks. We need them welfare checks. So King David says, listen, I don't have any money for you. What do you mean you don't have any money for you? Open up the brinks, open up your safe. Nah, King David tells them, listen, I understand there's a famine in the land, but this is for the temple. This is for the holy temple. We can't touch this money. This is holy money. Oh, please, we're dying. King David, we're dying, can't you see? 3 years of a famine. Amazing. So therefore, summarizing, on one hand, King David was very, very well-to-do. How did he become rich? He became rich after the victory over Goliath, when the Jewish women just engulfed him with tremendous amounts of silver and gold and copper, etc., precious stones. So he was well-to-do. On the other hand, he wanted to keep this. All of this money he was going to keep in order that the house of God, the Temple Mount, would be a place of beauty, a place that the whole world would look up to, and to have tremendous reverence to it. It would be so beautiful. On the other hand, he was a very poor man, King David, because the Jewish people, suffering 3 years of famine, came to him periodically and asked for assistance, asked for them welfare checks. No deal, said King David, and he turned them away. So he was, on the other hand, he was poor. It's sometimes, the people that are millionaires and they don't have in their pocket, they don't have $1 on them. They have all their assets somewhere, in the world tied up. So something like that. But there's really something unusual. It says our sages bring down in Yalkut Shimoni, Kings, first book, paragraph 186, tells us an amazing story. When it was time for King Solomon to build the temple after his father passed away, he has all of these assets that his father put away for all these years. And he was so strict and stringent to make sure that it would not be used for anything mundane. Not even for the Jewish people and going through a famine, people dying. King David is keeping this for that day when they will build the temple. So now, King Solomon has the big opportunity. He has it made in the shade. He doesn't need any assistance. He has all of the money. And our sages tell us that he refused to use those assets. The gold and the silver and the copper, the precious stones. He refused. Why? Because of the fact that the Jewish people had suffered for 3 years and his father, King David, refused to assist them. Instead of opening up the safe and giving out money, charity, one of the highest commandments in the Torah, to help another Jew, King David refused. So therefore, King Solomon was adamant not to use. He was upset with his father, refusing to assist the Jewish people who were in terrible, dire straits. So he did not use any of that money. Amazing. Did not use any of that money to build the first temple. The use. Are we allowed to use in the temple metal, steel? And we have some verses here. Verse number 1. It says in the end of the portion of Jethro, in the book of Exodus, it says the following. It says, when you build an altar made out of stone, do not place on this altar any type of steel or metal. Why? Because this material, steel, metal, is material that goes to produce swords, weapons of destruction, of death. And this will contaminate the holy altar. That's a pretty serious verse that we have here. We are not allowed, when we build the altar made out of stone, we are not allowed to place upon it any type of metal or steel, because that represents weapons of war, of death, and the temple represents a time of wholesomeness, time of peace. This is not only true, according to Jewish law, this is not only true that we are not allowed to use steel or metal on the altar, but also on the ramp that leads up into the altar. We're also not allowed to place or build it with any steel pieces. Why? Because this represents weapons of destruction. We're not allowed to use that. So it seems once again very woke that in the temple we're not allowed to use. It's looked down upon. Once again, so we have, it seems like twice God tells King David, you will not be able to build a temple because you have fought so many wars and you've spilled blood of the enemies, and that does infuse well with the temple idea of wholesomeness, of peace, of tranquility, of love. So it seems like very woke. Also we see you're not allowed to use metal or steel on the altar or on the ramp that leads to the altar. Another step forward in our journey, it says the following in the book of Exodus, portion of Mishpatim 21:14. It says the following, that if a person maliciously takes a weapon and kills a fellow Jew, if you see this person coming to work, coming to the temple to do some service in the temple, you must remove such a person. Once again, this is a person who killed a fellow man. And then he goes to do service in the temple. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, but no thank you. So the Torah teaches us, you remove them from the altar. Do not let him do the service of God. It's not, it doesn't gel very well one with the other. So once again, we see what seems like a very woke concept of if you have a person that killed somebody, there is no place for such a person to do service in the temple of God. Okay, so let's clarify a few things. Point number one. Okay, in the Mechilta, in the words of our sages, Mechilta, in the end, the book of Exodus, in the end of the chapter, portion of Jethro, it says the following, on the verse, you shall not build the altar with any type of steel or metal. So our sages come and tell us an amazing addition. Not what we thought. Listen to this. Our sages tell us it is true. We are not allowed to build the altar and the ramp with metal or steel because it represents war. However, we are able to use metal and steel, the same material that represents war and killings and deaths, which we thought had no room for the temple. King David cannot build the temple because he's a man of war, spilled blood. What? It tells us you could use these materials to build the sanctuary of the temple and the Holy of Holies. Like, boom! Man, this is like, if you're still sitting, man, you really didn't get this. You could use metal and steel, which represent war, fighting, violence, bloodshed, wars. You could use it for the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies. Whoa. And it says, you might think that if we're not allowed to use steel and metal for simple vessels of the temple like the ramp and the altar, how much more so for much more seriously holy parts of the temple, like the sanctuary, like the Holy of Holies, when the high priest would go in only once a year on the day, a holy day of Yom Kippur. You would think it would go without saying we're not allowed to use metal or steel. But we have a verse, and our sages look into this verse that we quoted at the end of the portion of Jethro, and from this they learn the halacha. This is, by the way, this is brought down in the Maimonides. Maimonides brings this down in a few places that we are allowed to use in different places in the temple. We are allowed. For example, the Maimonides tells us that in the times of the Maccabees, in the times of Hanukkah, we all know that when the Maccabees came and they rededicated the temple, which was defiled by the Gentiles, by the Greek Syrians, well, the Maccabees came and they set up a menorah, candelabra, and it was made out of spears. It's in Hebrew, it's shipudim shel barzel. It was blades of steel, and they built this candelabra, a menorah with steel. And that's, we all celebrate the holiday of even Reform Jews and Jews that aren't affiliated. They love celebrating the holiday of Hanukkah. But what's going on over here? Why did they use steel and metal? That represents their victory in war. And I thought wars don't gel together with the temple. Very interesting. So the Rambam does bring this down in chapter 1, the 18th verse. And this is not, he doesn't just bring down this as a law during the times of Hanukkah, of the Maccabees. He brings this down as a general law, that you are allowed to make the menorah out of material, steel and metal. You're allowed to make those, you're allowed to make them out of that material. Next, in an amazing lesson, another amazing lesson, we have in Tractate Shabbat, on page 90, side 1. The Talmud tells us that in the time of the Second Temple, there was metal and steel that was used in order to chase away, in order to keep away the various birds from contaminating the temple. Now today, if you go to the Kotel in Jerusalem, you could see on the wall, okay, you could see, or maybe coming off the wall, you see all these, like they look like spikes coming out of different places on the wall in order to keep the birds, the pigeons, off the walls, because you know what pigeons do when they have to relieve themselves. So people were finding themselves very interesting souvenirs that they would receive on their jackets, on their shirts, on their head. You're going out with some girl and she comes back and she has on her head, you might not want to keep the relationship going with her. So many places, whether it works or not, that's something else. In fact, I was there this past Shabbat. I was there, and thank God these birds have figured out ways, even though there's all these spikes coming out, they have their way that they go past them. So in order, they don't even have to stand on the spikes, they just fly above, and right after that there's plenty of room for them to make their, in fact I saw some eggs up there. There were nests up on one place, and you see a lot of those birds, they figured it out. By now they figured it out how to work it out. But in the times of the Second Temple, maybe the birds weren't so smart, and they had this apparatus to try to stop these birds from contaminating the holy temple. So we see once again that this contraption, in order to keep the birds away, was a contraption that was made out of steel or metal. These are all materials of weapons of destruction, of war, of death, bloodshed. And we see that they were used in the building of the temple once again. Now there's an amazing idea here that I want to throw in parentheses, but an amazing idea in life. in Rav Kook, Rav Avram Yitzchak Kook, passed away, I think, in 1933 or 35. He has one of his many books is called Ein Hayah, and he has on the tractate of Shabbat, the 9th chapter, it's the 148th paragraph in the tractate of Shabbat. So, it says the following, that even though we know that the temple represents the future world where there is no more war, bloodshed, even so, we're still not there. And therefore, within the temple, we did find metal, as we mentioned, this trap, this contraption to chase away the birds. Or we saw that you could use it in the sanctuary, to build a sanctuary, to build the Holy of Holies. We saw that in the times of the Second Temple, when the Maccabees came and rededicated the temple, they used a menorah which was built out of metal and steel. So there is a place, even in the temple, for such material that remind us of war and bloodshed. Why is that? It says the following. He says that the birds that were meant to be kept away, the ravens, not the Baltimore Ravens, don't get excited about the NFL, but ravens. Ravens represent, why did the Talmud bother to tell us what type of birds? I mean, we're not Dr. Doolittle. It's not National Geographic, babe. So why is it telling us a raven? Because ravens are not kosher. They're impure. And that's an amazing. Even though these contraptions were to keep away all birds, they specifically mention a bird which is impure, which is not kosher, and that's the raven. So, he says the following, that in order that forces of evil will not latch on to the temple or the Jewish people, God, with His great wisdom, has given us a tremendous lesson, a holy lesson, that at times we must use force. At times we must destroy and break. And he brings 2 verses, Rabbi Kook, from the Torah, to destroy the enemies of the Jewish people in Psalms, to take their leaders and take them with weapons of steel and metal and to break them, destroy them. Or another verse in Psalms, Tiroen b'shevet barzel, destroy the nations with rods of steel and metal. So he brings down, Rav Kook, a tremendous idea that a Jew stands on 2 legs, not 1 leg. There is a time and a place for everything, as King Solomon said. There is a time for love. But in that same holy temple, which represented in certain places, the message was loud and clear. There is no room for weapons of destruction in certain places, but yet in other places in the temple, there was room for such. And therefore that is to be even, and it to be solid ground, not extreme, but we have to be on solid ground, to be in the middle. And therefore, there is a place, even in the Holy Temple, when the Jewish people are threatened with violence or to be contaminated, there is a place to take weapons and take and fight and destroy the enemy of the Jewish people. This is an amazing lesson brought down by Rav Kook on the Talmud tractate of Shabbat, page 90, side 1. This is a tremendous lesson, always to remember. We have two hands, we have two legs, and we must use them. The right represents always kindness. That has to be the leading. But the left represents judgment, represents courage and strength to fight. We need both. We need both of those together. Okay. Next. We brought a verse from the portion of Mishpatim, that if a person has killed another person and then he comes to service in the temple, to do service in the temple, we stop them. We stop them. And bring them down from the altar. Who are we talking about? Who are we talking? Are we talking about non-Jews? Are we talking about Jews? Who exactly are we talking about? So, our first source is brought by the Mechilta in the portion of the beginning of the portion of Mishpatim. We quoted it from chapter 21, verse 14. Listen closely. It uses the expression when a person maliciously comes against his friend. The terminology used here is re'eu, and we have a rule of thumb in the Torah that when it says re'eu, we're talking about Jews and not talking about non-Jews. So this verse, when somebody has killed another person and then we are commanded, such a person has no place in the service of God in the temple. Therefore we remove him from servicing God and we move him from the altar. This is talking about a Jew that has killed another Jew. So therefore, moving back to King David. Who did King David kill? King David didn't kill Jews, not that we know about. He killed non-Jews. He went against all the nations of the world and destroyed them. So what's the problem? Why can't King David build a temple? What blood did he spill? What wars? He fought against the nations of the world, the enemies of the Jewish people, those that were going to destroy us. What is his transgression here? Next, in an amazing lesson, before we go on to that explanation, the Har Ephraim, who is Rabbi Ephraim Zev, who gives a commentary on the Mechilta, he says the following on the word re'eu, his friend. This is not talking about the non-Jews. That if a person from Israel has killed one of the non-Jews, he is exempt, because the non-Jews are not considered they don't come under the category of re'eu, of friend. So no one's saying that you can go around killing people, but this is not talking about that situation. This is talking about a Jew that killed a fellow Jew. And therefore, we take him away from the service of the temple. There's an amazing story in last week. We read in the portion, 2 weeks ago, in the portion of Lech Lecha, we see that there was a battle that was going on between 4 nations against 5 nations. Nothing, it seemed like nothing to do with the Jewish people. Somehow one of the kings is able to capture Lot, and Lot is brought into captivity. Abraham finds out about this, and he goes to fight against the 4 kings. There was the first battle was the 4 kings versus the 5, and the 4 kings won, and now Abraham is coming against the 4 kings. So Abraham is coming against the 4 kings in order to release his nephew Lot from captivity. So he comes, he's victorious, he's able to retrieve Lot, and he comes to the king, Melchizedek, the king, and the king who was a priest himself. Our sages tell us that this king, his name was not really Melchizedek, his name was Shem, the son of Noah. And he comes and presents to Abraham, he gives him bread and wine. Now this is very unusual for the Torah. Who gives what exactly was on the menu? I mean, this is not McDonald's, this is not Jack in the Box, Burger King here, telling us what the menu was. Why is the Torah going to lengths to tell us what the king gave, what the king of Sodom gave to Abraham? So, one of the commentators, Rabbi Yitzchak Horovitz, he was the head of the Jewish court in Europe of Brad, in the city of Brad, and he says an amazing lesson that when Abraham came, it says by our sages that Abraham killed more of the enemy. Abraham killed more soldiers than between the original war between 4 kings and 5 kings. Abraham killed more men than the war between the 4 and 5 kings. That's an amazing number. That's an amazing number. Abraham killed more people. So Abraham, he knew this verse. Abraham knew the whole Torah. And he knew this verse that tells us that if somebody killed somebody, you have to remove, if they come to serve God, they are removed from serving God. You cannot come and serve God in a place that represents peace and tranquility and love. So Abraham is thinking to himself, oh my God, look how many men I've killed. Look how many people. I killed more people than the war between the 4 and 5 kings. I have no chance to serve God in the temple or wherever. So the king of Sodom, Melchizedek, he comes and he specifically, the Torah tells us what he gave. Why? Because Rabbi Yitzchak Horovitz is an amazing commentary. He tells us that the wine represents that in the time when the temple stands, there is the daily. There's a funky word for it, I don't remember it, libation, something about bringing wine. Every day there was wine that was brought to the temple. That's part of the service. And then there was bread that the king brought, Melchizedek. What does that represent? That represents all the flour-based sacrifices that were brought to the temple. Not only were there animal sacrifices, but there was also, was brought before God, were various flour offerings. Maybe that's a better word, offerings here. So that's the lesson. Abraham is nervous. Abraham is frightened that perhaps he will not be able to serve God in whatever form, shape or form it might come to be, because of the fact that he spilled blood. King David was not able to build the temple, we think, because of the fact that he spilled blood. We'll understand that in our next class. But you're not allowed to bring metal and steel into the temple. So it seems very clear why, it's understandable why Abraham was so frightened and saddened that from now on he is no longer able to participate in the service of God because of all the bloodshed that he caused, all of the warring to save his nephew Lot. So Melchizedek says, Avram, put your worries to rest. There's nothing to worry about. That is not talking about killing the wicked people. You killed wicked people. You saved the righteous people. You killed wicked people. And that is not what God is saying. When God says you take off the murderer, that's talking about a Jew killing another fellow Jew. But we're not talking about wicked people. That is a whole different subject. That's a whole different story. You have no problem. Abraham, here's some bread, which represents all of the flour offerings you will be able to bring to the temple, Abraham. Here's the wine. All of the wine offerings you will be able to bring to the temple. Don't worry about it, Abraham. All of the killings of the wars that you've done were to eliminate the wicked and to protect the righteous. Folks, don't go away. God willing, next week, first day of Kislev, we shall be back and return. And part 2 is Judaism woke.